Well, welcome to our first workshop. This is entitled Can't Stop the Feeling Anymore, Compliance, Resistance, and the Use of Self from an Orthodox and Jungian Perspective. This workshop involves a panel that you see here. I'll introduce each member. First we have Pia Chaudhari, PhD, Analyst in Training from the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association in New York. Next is Father Adrian Budica, who is the Director of Field Education at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary in New York. Next is Father Levine, who's a chaplain, a major in the U.S. Army in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And lastly, we have Michael Monhart, who's also an analyst in training at the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association in New York. So we welcome our panel, and they will each speak, and there'll be time for questions at the end. Thanks. I'm just going to... Can I pass? Well, John, where did John go? Yes. So this is for ancient faith, and that's for volume.
All right, thank you, Brenda. Good morning, everybody. Oh, this is very loud. My name is Father Adrian Budica, and we are blessed to have you with us to be part of what we call ACPE, which is short for the Analytic Psychology and Orthodox Christian Consultation. We're in dialogue with each other, and for the next 5 minutes or so, I'll give you an introduction of what ACPE, how it came together, and some of the activities that we have presented. And then we'll go into a discussion about compliance, resistance, and the use of self, as the title suggests. We've been introduced, and I think each one of us will give a brief introduction of what we're doing before our panel. And then the panel we plan to have, when we say consultation, that means that we try to have a discussion here, but then we would like to have a discussion with a large group, with all those of you here present. So that means after we speak for about 8 to 10 minutes each, maybe less, we'll introduce you and we'll welcome you as part of the dialogue with us here. ACPE began in 2015, the winter 2015-2016, and it started as a personal interest at St. Vladimir's Seminary. Several of us discovered that we have a common interest as Orthodox Christians and resonating with Carl Jung developmental psychology. And we have created the group. On our website, we say that Ecumenical Patriarch has said that all the creation is a sacrament. All of creation is a locus of encounter with God, and the natural order of creation is divine theophany. So in this spirit, this initiative, ACPE, was born out of a desire to better understand the human person, part of creation, and in the Orthodox tradition, the image of God as it heals and it flourishes. And we thought, and we made this statement, and it's still on our website, that Orthodox Christianity and the Jungian or analytical psychology have each a tradition of exploring the depth of a person, the psyche, and until recently their insights have been separated by thousands of years of cultural, geographic, and linguistic differences. In our rapidly evolving world, we believe there is now an opportunity. We believe that this is an opportunity for us, for real discourse between the two, to share perspective and discover possible areas of resonance and collaboration in our respective ways of pursuing healing in the contemporary society. So in the next few slides, I'll give you an example of the meeting that we had in 2017 and 2018. In 2017, we started, it was an all-day meeting at Union Theological Seminary, and we had the first part of the morning small group discussions. And as you may see on the slide, we put together themes to look in parallel, for instance, at deification and individuation, or the shadow, or the feminine. So there were small groups. And then we came into a large group and we had presentation. This is the program of the day. And here is an example of a quote that we provided and we put in parallel, Carl Jung saying about the shadow. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involved recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge, and therefore, as a rule, meets with considerable resistance, the word of the day, if you will, the word of the conference. And we'll put that in dialogue, resistance with the Orthodox Christian theology, specifically Anytime in the Orthodox tradition we talk about Christ trampling down death by dying, and Saint Siloana Matatos inviting each one of us as Christians to keep our mind in hell and do not despair. How is that similar and how is that different when we talk about shadow? What is the overlap and what is the stark difference? In March, earlier this year, we had a meeting again at the Union Theological Seminary, and the title was Being and Becoming, a conversation from Jungian and Orthodox Christian perspective. We talked more anthropological themes, and the panel was Father John Baer, Pia, Dr. Harry Fogarty, Father Sean, who is here, and Michael was the moderator of that meeting. And in a similar way, there was a panel discussion and then questions from people there. And here we are, show and tell. I've told you about it, so let's show you how it works. We hope to have a small discussion on Can't Stop the Feeling Anymore, compliance and resistance, and the use of self from an Orthodox and Jungian perspective, and then welcome your comments and your questions, your participation, your reactions to anything that were presented. So, Michael?
Hello? Hello? Oh, okay. I'm really happy to be back in this very inspiring environment again, especially with my colleagues. I have a couple pages that I was just going to go through in order to kind of give time to my colleagues, but also more so for discussion, which last year, which was so fruitful. I'm going to probably try to read a little fast. So the theme of compliance and resistance, I find, is an incredibly fertile ground of contemplation from both an Orthodox and a Jungian, and I would say a psychoanalytic perspective in general. Alongside my background in psychoanalysis, I've approached our group dialogue from my personal engagement with the Cistercian or Trappist monastic tradition. The Cistercians look with reverence and for guidance to the early Christian fathers and mothers, most especially to the desert experiences at the foundation of Western monasticism. And I would say for me, most influential have been the writings of Evagrius and Cassian. In both Jungian and psychoanalysis and in the writings of these early monastics, we find centuries and cultures apart, modes and methods of self-transformation, with the added sense that transformation brings healing. In Evagrius, he proposes a path of purifying the senses so that we can see objects truly and move towards a contemplation of the Trinity. In Jung, through the process of individuation, a greater experience of transcendent wholeness is sought. This is not to conflate in any way the experience of the Trinity with that of wholeness, but I do want to emphasize that for Jung, the latter of wholeness by no means precludes or denies that of the former, the experience of the Trinity. So in a way, compliance and resistance is one of the points of most curiosity at the heart of our group's dialogue from the very beginning. In our first meeting, one of the most potent topics of conversation was the uses and dangers of fantasy. In a psychoanalytic setting, I would cast compliance and resistance as when to comply with, when to pursue, amplify in an analytic session a fantasy, an image, and when in general it should be resisted. To some degree, this is a conscious decision, but I would also see compliance and resistance in the sense of when and how to comply with the grace of God and feeling the humbling edge of our resistance to God's will and grace. In Jungian terms, we would construe this as a compliance to the call of the self and resistance, in more classical psychoanalytic terms, as a mechanism of obstructing access to the unconscious. And I think Father Sean will kind of demonstrate this in very clinical terms in his work. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus on the former dialectic of compliance and resistance in the case of fantasy. While the early monastics developed a seemingly comprehensive demonology, there was a wisdom born of the experience of isolation in the desert, that mere suppression, and here I'm considering suppression as resistance, doesn't always work. Inbar Graver, in a fascinating new study of early Eastern monastic traditions, asceticism of the mind, writes, quote, "The paradoxical effects of suppression shed new light on the nature of the challenges involved in the practice of attentiveness. At the same time, they underscore the observational skills of the Desert Fathers and their followers, who seem to be well aware of the counterproductive effects of attentiveness when misapplied. From their own experience, they knew that an anxious, teeth-gritting effort to repel evil thoughts and the demons that lurk behind them is ineffective and even counterproductive. As Cashin admits, the more earnestly we try to fix our thoughts upon God, quote, the more vehemently the mind is carried away by wandering thoughts and shifting distractions. Similarly, Mark the monk insists that the only way to escape from a tempting thought is through patience and prayer. If you would oppose it without these, it only attacks you more strongly, she writes. Clinically, we see this mind carried away most acutely in cases of borderline disassociated pockets, say, of drug, alcohol, or sexual addiction. Or we can see it in a newly married individual who, as their relationship continually deepens, finds themselves increasingly consumed and preoccupied with minor molehill annoyances that quickly cascade into a mountain that threatens the very existence of the relationship. It's an almost reflexive or compulsive pull towards catastrophic thinking, a compulsive fantasizing that the worst is going to happen, which leaves no room for the others and no room for the input or the reception of the grace of God. So the Desert Fathers were known for a radical hospitality, a setting aside of all personal desires and needs of the moment to offer an unconditional welcome to a guest. Yet at the same time, their spirituality is a spirituality of resistance, even spiritual warfare against the machinations and trickery of the devil. So how did they discern between guest and devil? How do we in the consulting room discern between the guest appearing in the guise of a fantasy, of a dream, in a charged encounter with a spouse or with a coworker? How do we distinguish between that guest who can bring new life, new energy, a pathway of healing, from the devil in a guest guise, who wants to lead us down the same pathways of habitual action? My reflections on this notion of radical hospitality were triggered by a statement of Evagrius, who wrote, "If Abraham, seated in the front of his tent, saw someone passing by, he welcomed him by his deed. And for those who lived in impiety, he spread a table. And by receiving foreigners, he did not miss the opportunity of meeting angels." All those who have lived abroad know the sweetness of hospitality and have been entertained by it as guests, when also a gentle word prepares a sweet table for the heart. With great zeal, then, let us practice the kindness of hospitality, that we may welcome not only angels, but also God. For the Lord says, "As you did to one of the least of my brothers, you did it to me." And then here comes the real kicker, I think, where it kind of shows the experiential foundation of Evagrius and the fathers in general. He writes, "One of those who partake more Gnostically in the practical life answered thus: the zeal of hospitality and a generous service rendered with enthusiasm usually destroys the fantasies of the demons that resound in the heart, if indeed one is free in some way of at least material concerns. When these things are done with humility and contrition of heart, they usually deliver more quickly one who suffers from fantasies." So I'm really intrigued by Evagrius' statement that hospitality rendered with enthusiasm destroys the fantasies of demons. What does he mean? In the analytic context, there is the experience certainly of giving voice to a fantasy and then sharing it with another that can loosen the effective grip it can have on a person. There's perhaps a confessional aspect to this sharing, but I think ideally in an analytic environment, it becomes more relational. That is, it's part of the formation of a dyadic relationship that between the analyst and the analysand that allows a third perspective, a third position to emerge. And so practically in the analytic situation, I'll look at where is the image coming from? Where is its generation point? Does it come from a dream? If so, I'll privilege it as a direct communication of the unconscious. Does it come from a synchronicity or even a less mild correspondence of events that give rise to a question, a fantasy, or an affect? If so, likewise, I'll regard this as at least partly unconscious in origin and privilege it. On the contrary, if it's a conscious fantasy, one that is being repeated, and sometimes, one that is being repeated, then I won't give it as much weight unless there is something new at the edges of the fantasy. Could this be akin to the desert monk welcoming the unknown stranger, while at the same time, if the stranger shows up again and again, no longer unknown, but all too familiar as an image of deceit or deception, they'd be turned away or fought, resisted. In this case, I try to work at mindfulness and a resistance to the fantasy, noting its arising and resisting it. I think Winnicott, the British psychoanalyst, really contrasted these the kind of good fantasy and bad fantasy in very clinically applicable terms. He wrote in his book, Playing in Reality, quote, "Dream fits into object relating in the real world." And here he's saying dream and object relating in the real world is in contrast to fantasy. Dream fits into the object relating in the real world, and living in the real world fits into the dream world in ways that are quite familiar, especially to psychoanalysts. By contrast, however, fantasizing remains an isolated phenomena, absorbing energy but not contributing to either dreaming or to living. To some extent, fantasy has remained static over the whole of this patient's life. That is to say, dating from very early years, the pattern being established by the time that she was 2 or 3. And this is in a clinical case presentation, which is I'd recommend. Another distinguishing feature between these two sets of phenomena is this, that whereas a great deal of dream and of feelings belonging to life are liable to be under repression, this is a different kind of thing from the inaccessibility of the fantasizing. Inaccessibility of fantasizing is associated with dissociation rather than repression. And I think this is the key point he's trying to make. Gradually, as this patient begins to become a whole person and begins to lose her rigidly organized dissociations, she becomes aware of the vital importance that fantasizing has always had for her. At the same time, fantasizing is changing into imagination, related to dream and reality. The qualitative differences can be extremely subtle and difficult to describe. Nevertheless, the big differences belong to the presence or the absence of a disassociated state. So the key difference for Winnicott in distinguishing between fantasy, which brings one away from the real world object relating, or from a religious perspective from the possibility of relationship with God, and dream in the real world relating, is the presence of dissociation. Dissociation by its nature resists conscious control. It is the presence of literally aspects of psyche which are not associated with ego control or even oftentimes awareness. This is where I think Evagris's notion of radical hospitality is perhaps applicable. The disassociated aspect is something which can defy conscious resistance. But in the clinical setting, if it is welcomed, it then is sometimes possible over time and with much work to bring it into association and to transform it into productive, creative imagination. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm going to come from a different perspective and to introduce myself again. My name is Adrian Budica, and I am a CPE supervisor, we used to be called, and we changed our title to CPE educator. For those of you that are not familiar, CPE stands for Clinical Pastoral Education. Clinical Pastoral Education is a form of experiential learning where people from different backgrounds, but specifically those that are in ministry, are invited to be serving in clinical settings. Many times it's in a hospital, but it can be in a prison, in the military, in several places, and they bring together their personal experiences together with their theology and put in dialogue with the behavioral sciences. Just as an introduction, I am the educator, and I invite people to do exactly that. If nothing else, when they come to CPE, they come with the understanding that they're going to learn some skills, which they do. And what I ask them to do often is sit at the gate student has to learn to make use of self, and they describe it as emotional availability, clear and responsible boundaries, positive use of power and authority, and non-anxious and non-judgmental presence. Now this is a level 2, or what we call in CPE, advanced level CPE. Why is that? Because in level 1, if nothing else, students just become familiar with the idea of countertransference. And I'm going to expand on that to the sense that even in CPE, because we reflect again many of the behavioral sciences, and I would argue that in the theological field, we start with this idea that countertransference, bad. Deal with it, be healed, and then you can come and serve others. Make sure it doesn't come in the way of you being in the midst of others. If nothing else, as an Orthodox Christian, I start by saying, I'm not there to offer anything of me. Oh no, God forbid. I'm there to give them the wisdom of God, right? The wisdom of the fathers and the wisdom, which is why many people when they come to CP, what do you mean? What I'm feeling in the moment? What does that have to do with anything? What does that have to do with what I bring to the patient or to the setting, right? So I'm building on the concept of Pamela Cooper White. She wrote the book Shared Wisdom. She's a Union Theological Seminary. And one of my colleagues in ACPE, actually, her name is, Yvonne Valeris. She talks about 3 types of use of self. She talks about the instrumental use of self, which is just sharing a past experience. And if nothing else, if you don't want to say exactly what it happened, you might say, if something like this happened to me, or when something like this happened to me, I felt X. Is that how you feel? And that's a very shallow level, if you will. And to some students, even that is dangerous. It feels very dangerous. And she's arguing that there's a deeper level to that, to share something that is a present experience, and sometimes maybe we have processed some of it, but we really have strong emotions. So sometimes we're going through something in our life, and to share something to the people that we're ministering to, again, it goes even deeper. And finally, she's making this argument for the use of self, which she calls transpersonal, use of self, which is the most immediate, raw emotion that the caregiver, chaplain, priest, physician, whoever it is, has in the moment, to take the courage, if nothing else, the spontaneity of that emotion in the moment and bringing it to the setting. So Pamela Cooper White, actually, she has this example that many times if you or I are caregiving for somebody, and then we're talking to them, and they say, man, Father Adrian, you look really nervous. A classical training of that would say how they approach that, where it's it's a red herring, it's a fight for power, they're trying to overturn, they're trying to, it's asymmetrical, they want to take care of me. Anyway, stay away from it. Don't even engage it, right? And we are arguing, again, based on this shared experience and staying together in the unknown. Actually, Pamela Cooper White used the Jungian term, which he himself borrowed from the alchemy, sitting together in the pool of shared knowledge, being together in the pool of shared knowledge. So what if, as a caregiver, I say, you know what, you're right, I am nervous. And then to engage that and to bring it back to the relationship again, not that the patient will start taking care of me, but if nothing else, to wonder what that does to the relationship, the fact that I acknowledge my feeling, the way you said earlier, Michael, even some thoughts or fantasies or feelings that come up. Jung is inviting us to say that they mean something, they're meaningful to the relationship, to the caring relationship that we have with each other. So this is the pool of shared knowledge, and I have a slide later where I compare it to the Good Samaritan. If nothing else, recognizing we are going on the same road. We are all walking from Jerusalem to Jericho, actually. I have not arrived at the destination, and I come back to help the one that fell among the thieves. But we're all on the same road. We're journeying together. I might be further on the journey, but I'm still on the journey. And the good thief, also, we know in the Orthodox tradition, if nothing else, is acknowledging and rebuking the other thief. He's saying, don't you see that you and I are in the same condemnation? So acknowledging that we are there. So I argue that God is present in the spontaneous, in the unplanned. We all see relationship, and God is intervening to change courses. So what are the assumptions that I bring to this relationship? Generally speaking, we tend to refuse or resist feelings, just like you said, Michael. From a more traditional aspect, culturally we have been raised by saying, well, if you're feeling this way, what are you going to do about it, right? So that comes to our caregiving relationship. If you're feeling this way, deal with your anger first, and then come back and take care of this person, right? As opposed to, yeah, and what does it mean that you are angry in the moment? That in turn, when we shut down our emotion, I think, that it shuts down the intra and interpersonal connections. And as a matter of fact, in the scripture, God is inviting us to give me all your heart. Let us commend ourselves, we say in the divine liturgy, ourselves and one another. All our light, everything that we are and we have, we give to Christ. We talk about empathy because in Hebrews, we talk about Christ as being the high priest who can suffer with us. And we, again, I said it earlier, God is present in the spontaneous unplanned. We meet God in the present moment. So when I say the pool of shared knowledge, the pool of common knowledge, some people, especially in the younger generation, might think that it looks like this. We plug in together in the common knowledge. And my response is, nope. Why not? Because the pool of shared knowledge, Jung would argue that brings us together with each other. We're not plugging in something that's outside out there, but it actually connects us to each other, that makes us being together as humans. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the Good Samaritan is the image of Christ, of taking on himself, taking us, taking the human, so that we be with us. Finally, I would like to add with a beautiful story that I found again in the writings of the Desert Fathers. It seems like there's a synchronicity there. If you're familiar with Abba Macarius, he has this beautiful story of use of self. In a nutshell, he's sitting by his cell and Satan is passing by. Now think about Abba Macarius recognizing who that person is and knowing exactly what he's doing and how he looks like. And Satan is wearing these flasks. And in very short, what is this about? I'm going to the brothers to the monastery. Abba Macarius was living by himself, secluded, far away from the pleasant monastery. What is this that you're doing? Well, I'm going to go to the brothers and I'm going to tempt them. And if this thing doesn't work, I'll try this one. And if this doesn't work, I'll try this one. I'll try this one. And he said, okay, go ahead. So when Satan comes back, Abba Macarius is asking him, so how did it go? I mean, paraphrasing. I'm sorry for that. So he said, not good, not good. Most of the brothers, they rebuked me, and none of them, I tried this and I tried this and nothing. And Abba Macarius is insisting and saying, well, was there really nobody there that actually took on this? And he said, well, wait, there is this one brother that every time he sees me, he's like dancing around and so happy, and he's the one that I can actually play with. Talk about, engaging it. What's his name? Theopemptus, godsend, if you will. So Abba Macarius picks himself up from far away where he is. He goes to the monastery, and he is meeting, of course, the brothers are glad to see him. He hasn't been there in a while. After everybody's done, he wants to see this brother alone by himself, and he's asking the brother, when they were alone, he asked, how are you getting on? And Theopemptus replies, thanks to all your prayers, everything is all well. And the old man asks, do not your thoughts war against you? He replied, no, up until now, everything is all right, because, and this is in the sayings of the Desert Father, he was afraid to admit anything. Abba Macarius said, the old man said to him, see how many years I have lived as an ascetic, and praised by all, I am old. Even though I'm old, the spirit of fornication troubles me. And Theopemptus said, I can imagine, like a sign of relief. Believe me, Abba, it is the same with me. The old man, the story goes by saying that the old man went on admitting that other thoughts still warred against him until he had brought him to admit that about himself. What a beautiful story. If nothing else, Abba Macarius taking the courage and the discernment to say, I know that this brother is struggling with something, and if nothing else, I know that he's just resisting it. And what I'm arguing, and I think what we're arguing here, is that there is no healing until that person was able to comply and to say, you know what, I'm resisting it. But hey, if Abba Macarius gave permission, if Abba Macarius after so many years is struggling with this and is feeling this way, thank God that I can do it. An invitation for you, brothers and sisters, again, in as much as we are looking toward Christ to heal us, if nothing else, it gives permission to one, knowing that sometimes the fear is much greater to admit of what they're struggling with, until you and I ourselves might say, I'm struggling with this myself, by the grace of God, however it is that you're. Thank you. Oh, no, sorry.
Okay. So I'd like to talk about compliance and resistance in military clients. As a chaplain, I work with military folks, and Department of Defense civilians all the time, those who have been deployed. And now that I'm in the orbit of the Beltway, the Northern Capital region, most of my clients now are in rather high-ranking positions. I see people that work in the Senate, and tons of folks that work in the Pentagon. So these are people that have obviously deployed much, worked very hard, and are burdened by many of the things that veterans carry. And that's just a kind of a glimpse of what my client population looks like. And I've been trained by the Army. The Army sent me to school to do a marriage and family therapy program, and then to do this work as my main job for at least the next couple of years. So lots of interaction with military individuals and a lot of couples and a couple of families. So compliance and resistance, I just wanted to talk about in general. Both of these terms I see operating on a two-way street in the therapeutic setting. Client to therapy, either resistance or compliance, and then therapist to the client, resistance or compliance. And the openness to influence between the two people in the exchange, I'm kind of looking at Carl Jung's metaphor of conjunctio, a union, a merging of lives. And in this metaphorical world, eros, love, is a key element in the therapeutic relationship. And therapeutic relationships can lack love. And that's, Father Adrian was talking about that, to stand outside, stand away, to keep the relationship at arm's length. Certainly therapeutic relationships can be inappropriately guided by misappropriated love, and that ends up looking like misconduct. That's obviously not the goal. But therapeutic relationships can also lack love and compassion and those kinds of images. So a lot of times the therapeutic relationship can be interrupted by a resistance to eros, to love. And a lot of times that looks like the unwillingness to be vulnerable to intimacy. Therapist and client enter the crucible of therapy together, and both will be changed by the transference, countertransference experience. That's just kind of a given, but that can be resisted and then interrupted. Managed properly, this intimacy can lead to healing of the soul, not just for the client, but also for the therapist. It's probably axiomatic that we don't enter into this work in order to heal ourselves. It's as obvious that many of us do that unconsciously. And calling to the priesthood and calling to any helping profession can often be a calling from a deep sense of woundedness that seeks remediation in that work. So that would not be the best scenario, but rather a conscious acceptance of the fact that when we enter into this work, we will be influenced. There's no way to keep at arm's length. And so managing that relationship such that it happens in a way that's beneficial both to the client and to the therapist would be, I think, a worthy aim. Now shifting from in general to military personnel. The military community is a paradox. There is an abject obedience to authority, and in the counseling experience, the therapist is an authority figure, irreducibly and unavoidably. So compliance can often look like just abject obedience, or rather abject obedience and just an ingrained push toward obeying the authority figure can look like compliance in therapy. It really isn't. The person's self is eclipsed by the authority figure and by the tendency just to submit and just to obey. And so when sometimes you think you're doing really well, wow, they're doing everything I tell them to do. And that person's never really showed up in the counseling room. I haven't even really been dealing with the real person. And if there's no awareness of that tendency, then it looks like things are going along swimmingly, and nothing is actually happening at all. So that's the idea of compliance. Resistance to therapy in the military context often looks like a resistance to this erotic, this eros-inspired intimacy. Military personnel don't do vulnerability. They don't do intimacy. which has some ramifications for their marriages constantly, but also within the therapeutic context, they just don't like it. So there's often an unconscious, sometimes a very conscious unwillingness to confront the shadow self. Jung calls this confrontation, as Father Adrian and as Michael pointed out, this kind of confrontation with the shadow, a profoundly courageous act that requires great moral effort. It's not easy to see that which I am that I would rather not be. Not necessarily my evil self. The shadow is not always equated with evil, but the part of me, the self that has been shamed, banished, contains my inferior function. The part of me that could bloom and grow as a manifestation of the flourishing of my personality, growth into my true and authentic self. That confrontation is often of great concern to military personnel, especially those who have been in combat, where the shadow does include some rather dark and difficult elements. So resistance to therapy may not be resistance to me as the therapist, or even to the therapeutic process, so much as resistance to vulnerability, an inability or an unwillingness to go into that vulnerable space and be changed by it. Military people are influencers. They are not the influenced, which is ironic because they're coming to counseling. But they don't often know why they're coming. They think they do, and then it becomes quickly visible that this relationship is for something a little bit different than they expected. And if they're willing then to take that step, we can do a lot of wonderful things. A lot of times there's a real strong resistance to that vulnerability. So countertransference, the therapist's unconscious unwillingness to get close to the monster. Working with military populations brings you really close to a lot of evil, a lot of darkness, and if in the countertransference I'm resisting the entrance into that space with the client, then we are again disengaged and not really moving forward in a most effective way. That can look like a lack of eros, a lack of compassion, or a fear of contamination by moral evil and taint. They've been in the crucible of war, and it's yucky and bloody and dirty, and I don't want to get that on me. So you stand over there, and I'll listen to you from here, and I won't enter the crucible with you. A refusal to join, sometimes out of secret contempt. In the wider therapeutic community, there's a lot of folks that have no real room in their moral framework for those who fight and kill. And there's a secret and sometimes unconscious contempt for that person. So I'll work with you, but only from a distance, because secretly I hate what you are. That does not lend to real therapeutic work. So compliance can often look like a willingness to risk vulnerability of intimate relationship that changes both client and therapist. It can look like that. It can be that, and that can be helpful. Am I willing to receive healing from this therapeutic relationship, both client and therapist? Am I willing to receive something from this experience and not just be the influencer, but be influenced? Am I willing to risk the vulnerability that receives from the client while remaining focused on the client's best interest and wellness, not abusing the client for my self-centered interests, keeping that balanced? I'm calling that kind of a, I don't know if this is, I'm just coined this term like 5 minutes ago, but a neptic vulnerability, a watchful vulnerability that doesn't just go in head first without being cautious, but is willing to take the risk, albeit with eyes open and with heart ready. And that, I think, equates with the humility that we heard about in this morning's keynote. What rests behind or underneath the client's resistance or compliance? Abject, self-eclipsing obedience? That's not really compliance in therapy. Conscious, unconscious projections onto the therapist? That's information with which to work, but it's not authentic relatedness. Fear of vulnerability, attachment wounds from infancy through childhood, not conscious resistance, but woundedness that we have to handle very gently. Maybe those are some helpful images. So those reflections come out of my work with the military population, and kind of interweaves, metaphorically, images from Jung's work and also just the basic idea of connecting with other human beings in therapeutic relationships.
I'll just look at my
Yeah.
my phone. Thanks. I just want to reiterate what a pleasure and honor it is to be here again. It's such a wonderful gathering and chance to really explore. I was so appreciative of Dr. Mamalakis' opening remarks last night that we get to really have questions here, because I think I don't want to speak for all my colleagues, but it's been such a rich conversation we've been having these past few years, but this is not a conversation that provides definitive answers. We're really asking big questions about these two fields and how they may or may not enrich each other. So it's just a gift to be able to be here and be having these conversations and be allowed to have questions and not answers. When I was thinking about this topic, I was thinking, just sort of the associations I have to the topics of compliance and resistance. So I'm just going to go through some mini slides on my phone, throw out some bullet points, and then we'll move quickly to the conversation. But generally speaking, I think we think of compliance as it can be respectful of authority, respectful of experience and training, of wisdom, even revelation and tradition, as we heard this morning about an obedience in a relationship to Christ. In the ascetic movement, we talk about it also as an effort of will. We strive to bring our will in line with God's will. I would say as an analyst in training on leave, I should clarify. But the shadow side of that compliance can be masochism. It can be just simply a kind of a refusal of one's own will. So there's always a little bit of curiosity about it. To resist also has the connotations of being rebellious, autonomous. It can be instinctual, a refusal of what is, a refusal to engage. But the shadow side of that can also be an unconscious movement towards self-preservation. So you never really know, from the outset, what might be going on. So the questions I have about compliance when I hear the word compliant and talking to colleagues about this is, the first question is, compliant with what? With whom? In the clinical setting, there's a big question of method here, because depending on what method you work in, you have a different sense of what's guiding the process. So ideally, in a spiritual and a pastoral context, you're hoping that God is guiding the process. Jungians might answer somewhat differently, even amongst themselves, about what guides the process. I like to think of self, Jung's concept of self with a capital S, which isn't the same as the ego complex, guiding the process. That's a different kind of use of self, but it's something that we can look to. I think therapists and all caregivers, we can all be tempted to think that we're guiding the process and that we know best, and this is how this ought to proceed. So there's a real question of compliant with what. And then there's I've always been very moved by Winnicott, whom Michael mentioned. He had a theory in studying, he was a pediatrician as well as a psychoanalyst, so he knew small children well. And he had a very moving theory about small children who show signs of delinquency. That in a setting where there's problems for the kids, a sign of delinquency can actually be a sign of hope. It's a sign of fight left in the child. A child who is totally compliant in a bad setting has actually lost their hope. They're actually functioning out of despair. And in a sense, that's the false self that Winnicott develops the theory of, which is what sounds like you sometimes see in the clinical setting. That it's a totally compliant persona. It has nothing to do with the interiors way down inside. So that's a real danger. And as you say, and you'll see it clinically because nothing happens. It ought to be happening because everything's going textbook, but nothing's actually happening. And there's often a sense of futility on the part of the patient. And then interestingly, both Winnicott and also Jung have this notion, Winnicott had an idea of creative illness, and Jung had this idea that symptoms can actually be teleotic. So parts of ourselves that are not compliant even with what we think is best, and this is a lot of what brings people into an analysis, is that I'm not being compliant with myself. My life isn't going the way I think it ought to. And I'm having these symptoms, I get these panic attacks, I don't understand what's going on. Something in me is not being compliant. And what is extraordinary, I think, grace-filled, is that both Jung and Winnicott saw there's a real possibility. When something like that's happening, the kind of radical hospitality that Michael was talking about, that Evagris is talking about, if you can invite it in and get it out of a dissociated form and into something that's connected, you actually bring back one of the lost sheep. Something comes in that wasn't there and or it was there, but it could only be there in the negative. So in that sense, you can actually, not usually at the time, but perhaps years later, be grateful for that non-compliant symptom that brought you to this new place. Mm-hmm. And then just briefly on resistance, again, so whose resistance? And Father Sean talked a lot about that. Is it, the patient's resistance? But if we look at Jung's concept of shadow, or, just anything that threatens us in our own sense of self, if we have to touch on it in our patient work, it may well set off our own resistance. Mm-hmm. When the patient's shadow touches on the analyst's shadow, you really, you're in the deep waters now, because now you're both really going to have to work through this, or someone's going to truncate the treatment. And shadow, again, as Father Sean was saying, is not just to be resisted, because as Jung talked about, sometimes shadow does contain our moral failings, and those are things we can confess, but sometimes shadow just contains that which you do not wish to be, even though it can be something perfectly wonderful. If you were a ballerina growing up in a family of mathematicians and you were always told that math is the only career forward, all of your artistic drive might just fall into shadow. It doesn't mean it's bad, it just means you deemed it bad and it went into shadow. But it will keep knocking in some other way, shape, or form in a way that feels non-compliant with your life's trope. So I think from the analytic side, we try to be very, very curious about what the non-compliance is. Let's just see. So what talks in the shadow? So just a brief foray into the theology of it, of more like the anthropology. And I've spent a lot of time wondering about it, and this is what I have managed so far. St. Maximus the Confessor had an extraordinary theory of will, of the human will. And he described the thelemic will as the natural will, is the power that longs for what is natural and contains all the properties that are essentially attached to nature. But because of our fallen nature and because of our fallen situation, we don't actually have strong access to the thelemic will. We can't just sort of move from it and act from it. So he described the gnomic will, which Andrew Louth elaborates, and I apologize, my slides seem to be better up there than they are on my phone, but let's see if you can hear me. But basically, gnomic willing is the deliberative willing. Should I have coffee? Should I have tea? That's an easy one. Should I skip this class? Should I go to this class? That's a little more. Should I marry this person? Should I not? Should I go to church today? All these kind of, when you're exerting your will, which is often what we're exhorted to use in terms of compliance. Use your will. So that's the kind of gnomic will. But if we look at Maximus's overall anthropology, which I don't have time to really get into, but his understanding that the logoi of being, that we all have this kind of innate principle within us that is derived from the logos, is essentially true to who we are, and forms a kind of a blueprint of our life, then something in us is connected, as we know as Orthodox, to the image of God. That's very closely linked to the thelemic will. What my question has been for a long time now is, can the thelemic will ever show up as resistance to situations where, like in the clinical setting, where you have basically what we would call the unconscious is pushing, a dream, an image, a repetition compulsion. Can that be related to this deep will, which has a very hard time expressing itself because we put layer and layer and layer of construct and sin and all kinds of stuff on top of it? So this is just a question I have about how some of this thinking could work with an anthropology that's quite complex in itself, and I hope St. Maximus will forgive me for trying to at least be in conversation with his theories. But it is interesting because the gnomic will, the more it's integrated with the thelemic will, the more whole the person is considered to be. And this I'll just close with. that for St. Maximus, integration was a primary trope, if you will, of his theology. And it was integration through eros, that, as Andrew Louth says, that for St. Maximus, we are creatures who love with a love that integrates all the layers of our being. And what I've been hearing from my colleagues today is very much the sort of, as Michael was saying, bringing the dissociated into the associated through love, through hospitality. And Father Sean is talking about the eros and the mutual influence, and again, there's the love there. And Father Adrian's talking about a real empathy that actually involves entering into and being vulnerable and being true with the other. All of these have an aspect of love to them, and they end up having an integrative capacity. And what's fascinating is they break down resistance. I mean, what I was hearing and what all of you were saying was that it's the empathy that calms the resistance. It's the inviting the demon, not inviting the demon, but engaging in a way in hospitality that calms it down, naming it properly. It's working with, you have the resistance to the vulnerability, but once you can get through that, if you can, real work can be done. So there's something in empathy that actually resistance, it sounds to me like it actually tames resistance in some way, or transforms it, really, is what we're talking about, and brings it into the realm of what can be transfigured. And I think that's very beautiful. So, thank you.
Thank you. So we would like to welcome your comments and questions and reactions. Anything that you might find hard to resist, or on the contrary, something that seems way out there and maybe completely off. What do you think of this, and maybe how are you part of this conversation?
Please come to this microphone. Ask questions.
First, can you hear me? Is this working?
No, that's for infant faith.
Yeah, if you come here, maybe.
Well, this is that's the same.
It's a problem of choice here. First, thank you very much. I've been looking forward for this seminar, for the questions you're asking, also what kind of questions and reflections are stirring up in me. So I have a commentary and then a question, and I'll start with the commentary. I was thinking about the fantasies, in what way fantasies could be obstructing knowledge. And the example with the radical hospitality. Some other analysts, like from a Lacanian perspective, he would ask, well, you're looking at the fantasy, but what is the desire behind that fantasy that functions like a projector and projects that fantasy? You need to know that desire. Or, as with Desert Father and his radical hospitality, his desire in himself turned off the projector on the other side, something that is not being seen here. On the other hand, I'm thinking about the dissociative part of us, those who are, you said they are not under conscious control. I believe they are not even under unconscious control either, that they need someone else there. First, they need to become fantasies to be integrated. So that's the comment. The question is about the shadow, and how much, how deep, and how necessary is to know the shadow from an Orthodox perspective. We know at confession, the priest does not need to hear everything for something to happen. And no psychoanalyst, I think, would say, well, you don't need to, or go head on like an idiot. But there is a big difference, I think, in how the shadow is treated. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start with the last question, because it's a question that actually has been a part of our dialogue. For the last 4 meetings that we had, is how far is too far, if that's what I hear you asking. And if nothing else, from an Orthodox perspective, I mean, we might have a sense of how deep is too deep, and I don't think I have an answer for the general interpretation of it. I think it comes down to the individual, and I can join with you in the idea that maybe as a psychoanalyst, pursuing it too far would not be of spiritual benefit to another, is that what I hear you saying. I'm always struck when we have the cycles of the tones. So when we have tone 6, we sing about Christ in the resurrection. We say, when Mary stood at thy grave, and the angelic powers are at the tomb, and then thou hast descended into Hades, and you weren't tempted by it. What? You, Christ, descended into Hades, and you weren't tempted by it. Like, what does Hades have that might tempt Christ? Again, it's something that I continue to reflect on to my practice, and if nothing else, to my teaching, because I'm more of an educator. I'm thinking that it's this temptation that sometimes going too deep into that might lead me to being in temptation and staying in that Hades. If nothing else, I want to believe that the tone 6 Scroparion, Apolitikion, however you call it, says that Christ went to the deepest of the deepest of the deepest. There is no place actually in Hades. St. Silouan actually tells us that Christ went all the way to the bottom of it, and there is no place in Hades where Christ hasn't been before us. Now this is Christ, and I'm trying to follow him, and if nothing else, I can understand that being there's a temptation actually, and by the grace of God, I try to say maybe too deep is too deep. Is that helpful?
Thank you. Thank you. Am I on mic?
Use both, but one is for the
Oh, boy. High technology. Thank you. I love Carl Jung. My master's thesis at Rutgers University with the Department of Religion used a lot of Jungian works. Metamorphosis, The Journey of Initiation. As a visual artist, storyteller, poet, caregiver, end-of-life caregiver, these are such profound energies. But I do have a question, and it's not a criticism, but it's a very deep concern that, in my mind, in my heart. We're dealing with these powerful energies, and we open portals in our lives to these powerful energies. As Orthodox Christians, how do we reconcile these archetypes, these shadows? How do we reconcile and embrace these concepts and experiences that may be viewed as antithetical, dangerous, and even occult, as hidden and shadowed? I recently retreated 1 week to a women's Orthodox monastery in South Carolina. I'm called to go to the monastery. There wasn't one Jungian book in the library. There wasn't one book on tarot, numerology, astrology, divination, all subjects that I have studied because of my interest as an artist and poet. Where do we draw the line? Where do we draw the boundary to protect ourselves, but to be both explorers and adventurers, and to be filled with knowledge that may be beneficial? Where do we draw the line?
That's a profound and beautiful question. Certainly one I've wrestled with. So I can only offer some thoughts, certainly no prescriptions. I think that Jung, of all the analysts, can be the most confusing for religion because he engages with it the most directly in a lot of ways and then does his own thing with it. And as I've told people many times, if you read Jung as a theologian, you're in big trouble. He's not a theologian, he is a psychoanalyst, and he spoke, many times, he gets tricky, but he does say many times, I'm not speaking of metaphysics, I'm speaking of psyche, I'm speaking of experience. For me personally, I take my stance in that God created the world and he deemed it good. All of creation belongs to God and is good. All that has being, evil is non-being, not being. So, yes, these energies can be very powerful and they can be extremely unnerving. At the end of the day, the question is whether they bring life. Because if they bring life, then I think we know we're on the track. The last slide that I didn't get a chance to look at talked about discerning the Spirit, and Jung has this beautiful quote where he says, I mean, I talked of Galatians and the fruits of the Spirit, but Jung has this beautiful quote where he says that no one can know what the ultimate things are. We must therefore take them as we experience them, and if such experience helps to make life healthier, more beautiful, more complete, and more satisfactory to yourself and to those you love, you may safely say this was the grace of God. Now again, he's not a spiritual father, he's not a theologian, but he's got his own level of discernment. I think where people go wrong, from my Orthodox perspective, is when you put something like tarot or I Ching or any of these things that Jung explored as ways into the deep psyche, and you make them divine. You make them uncreated. Because in Orthodoxy, we're very clear that it's uncreated energies of God. We're not dealing, I would refute Jung, who says it's all psyche. I don't think it's all psyche. I think what psyche is psyche, and God is God. So if you keep those things separate, then I think you've got it at the beginnings of a discernment. The rest is very contextual, and I'm not a spiritual director, so I don't want to say, but it's a beautiful question, and I'm glad you asked it. Thank you.
If you will, thank you also for the question. Speaking of use of self, I'm not sure where you're. Oh, here. Hi. The first time Pia and I met at St. Vladimir Seminary at the chapel, we had a short conversation, and I started emailing her, and if nothing else, I started sharing with her exactly this. Hey, I'm reading St. Silouan, and he talks about keep your mind in hell. How far away is too far away to keep mind in hell? And actually, we had a few email exchanges, and then we decided maybe it's better to talk in person, if nothing else, to have this conversation of, there is this danger, and I resonate with you actually. When you asked the question, it brought me exactly back to the fact that, again, if there is synchronicity, you are something that we ourselves continue the conversation and trying to understand. Yeah.
Father Stephen Muse gave me an interesting quote the other day. We were talking about the work of ministry and how easy it is to burn out, and the quote is, if you don't do your night work as a priest, liturgy is not going to go so well for you. I would say in terms of psychotherapeutic work, in people care in general, if you don't do your night work, the day work is probably not going to go as well for you as it could. And the openness to danger in the care for the other is definitely visible. And so groundedness in the spiritual tradition of the Orthodox Church, neptic prayer, the prayer of the heart, the divine liturgy. So psychology and in many ways, the things that we're doing as human beings and looking at phenomena, we're creating constructs to try to define and describe what we're looking at. Those are constructs, and Jungian psychology is a construct. Cognitive behaviorism is a construct. Social constructivism is a construct. The divine liturgy is ontology. The uncreated energy of God coming to us in this world and being communicated to us right where we're at, molecularly, physically, and spiritually. Christ is the illumination of our soul and of our body. And so I would say that the night work of caring for others is remaining just absolutely grounded in prayer and in the celebration of the services of the church. And that, I think, is not just protective against the yuck of the world, but empowering to encounter it and to overcome it in the power of the one who trampled down death by death. So where death is, death has been defeated. And if we do our night work, if we pray, and if we go to church, and if we receive the Eucharist, and we ground our life in that world, then where death is, it is trampled down, and where life is, we can celebrate and engage. Maybe not always take on. We may have to celebrate, engage, and reject. Interesting thought. Nope. But we can engage and not fear for the status of our soul and of our self.
Thank you, everybody. I put up our website, so if you'd like to stay in touch, please visit our website. There is a sign-up list for emails and upcoming meetings. And thank you for participation.